Alright everyone, so in this part of our Express.js tutorial, I'm going to show you how to set up Jest and use Jest to write unit tests and run them for your Express application. So Jest is a testing framework for JavaScript. It's very popular. It's made by Facebook, or now known as Meta, and it's been around for a very long time, and you can use Jest to write tests and run them for really any JavaScript application. Many people use it to test Node.js server-side apps. You can use it also to test React apps or Angular apps. It's very versatile. So let's go ahead and get started. So inside my project, one thing that I do want to mention is that remember that we are using ES modules. So if you recall, inside our package.json file, you can see that I have the type set to module and all of my file extensions are ending with .mjs. Now, there's nothing wrong with using ES modules, and it is the way to go in the future with developing server-side with Node.js. However, as of right now, they currently do support ES modules. However, it requires experimental flags, so you need to enable an environment variable. And while that might work out of the box, there are some things that don't necessarily work. And after doing some research on Stack Overflow and some of the GitHub issues, I've came to the conclusion that some of the things that I was trying to get to work just wasn't simply working, to say the least. So the options that we have are we can either revert our entire project to CommonJS. So what that means is we remove this type, it'll set everything back to CommonJS, because that's what the default system is. And then we would have to remove all of our import statements and replace them with require statements. So instead of import express from express, we would have to do const express equals require express, like this. And then we would have to change all of our export statements as well. So instead of export const mock users, I would have to do module.export and then pass in mock users like this. And obviously that's not something that is possible for many projects, because you might have already written so much code and you can't just go through every single file and change all those lines. It just doesn't really make sense. So I figured out a solution where we can actually configure Babel, which is a transpiler, and we can use Babel to actually take all of our MJS files and kind of like transform them from ES modules into CommonJS, so that way Jest can actually execute them correctly. So we're going to leave our type set to module. We're going to leave all of our code the way it is. We're not going to change anything at all. We're not going to modify the import statements, nothing. And I'm going to show you how this is going to work. Now, if you're someone that is just trying to learn how to write unit tests and you might already have Babel or TypeScript set up, then Jest actually has documentation on how to configure Jest with the right environment. If you go to their docs, they actually show you right over here if you're using Babel, Webpack, TypeScript, all this stuff. So for example, if you're using TypeScript, you can use TS Jest right over here. It even mentions over here, and it's basically just a preprocessor, so you can actually use Jest to test your project written in TypeScript. So to get started, we need to install a couple of dependencies. So I'm going to type npm I -D, because I'm going to install these as dev dependencies. So the packages are at babel/core, at babel/node, at babel/preset env. So that's it for Babel. We then need to install Jest as well. And then let's go ahead and hit enter. So while this is happening, I'm going to go ahead and go into my project folder, and I'm going to go ahead and just set up the Babel RC configuration file. So you're going to go ahead and create a new file. I'm going to call it .babelrc, like this. And then I'm going to go ahead and pass an object like that. And then we need this presets field, and this is going to be an array. And inside this array, we're actually going to pass an array, and then inside this inner array we're going to pass a string, and we're going to type at babel/preset -env, and then we're going to pass a second argument or second element inside this inner array. So we have this object right over here, and this object is going to have this targets property, which is going to map to an object, and in that object we're going to have node set to current. Okay, so we're just configuring the preset env for Babel. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the Babel stuff. Now let's go ahead and close that. So our packages have finished installing, and let's go ahead and type npm init jest at latest. So we want to configure Jest, and what this will do is set up a Jest config file for us. So I'm going to hit enter. And then it's going to ask us some questions. So it's going to say, would you like to use Jest when running tests? So this will just create a test script for us. So I'm going to hit yes. Would you like to use TypeScript? If you're using TypeScript, then press yes, but I'm going to press no. Choose the test environment. So we are testing a server-sided Node.js application. So we're going to hit enter for Node. But if you're testing like a front-end application for React, then you'd want to hit JS DOM. Do you want just add coverage reports? We'll hit no for that. We'll just select it as V8. And then for this one, you want to hit yes. Automatically clear mock calls, instances, context, and result before every test. This will ensure that whenever you run your next test, there won't be any leftover mock calls or mock data from the previous test. And that's actually very important. So you can see that it modified the package JSON file, and then we created this just.config.mjs file. Okay, so we're not done yet because there's one more thing that we need to do inside our just.config.mjs file. So right over here, we need to go to this transform property. Currently, it is commented out, but we want to uncomment this part and we want to set this to be an object. And now what this transform property will take care of is it will look for those source files that match a regular expression and transform the source code into something that Jest can actually run, which is pretty much plain JavaScript. So what I'm going to do inside this object is I'm going to use this regular expression right over here. I'm going to copy it, and you all can just copy this as well. So this will just look for our MJS files inside our directory. And what I'm going to do is map this value to Babel Jest. So this is going to be the tool that it's going to use to deal with the transformation. And now we actually didn't install Babel Jest, but when you install Jest, it actually does install Babel Jest for you as of right now. If you look at your node modules, you can see that there should be this Babel Jest package right over here. So that's how we can verify that that package was installed for us. Okay, so we're done with this part, and let's just also go into right over. Let me go over here. Module file extensions. So we'll just uncomment that, and you can remove the ones that you don't need. So I'm not going to be using TSX or JSX or TS. So I'm just going to remove all that, and I'm just going to close this out. So we should be done with our setup. We do need to actually go into our package JSON file, and for some reason, when we ran the Jest configuration, it did not override this test script. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. Whoops, let's go ahead and do that. So all we have to do is just have this test script and then have it execute this Jest binary. So this will look inside your node modules inside this bin folder, and it will look for this Jest binary right over here, and it'll just run that command. And that's what will actually run your test for you when you are ready. So let's go ahead and write a very, very simple test and kind of like explore the Jest API. So what we're going to do inside our source folder, we're going to create a new folder, and I'm going to name it __tests __. And this is industry standard. And this is where you're going to place all of your tests. So you need to create a file, and then you want to name the file of your test, ideally something that resembles the actual file name. So for example, if I were testing, let's say, something inside my users.mjs file inside the routes folder, then I would want to name the test file something like users dot, and then the extension here is where you want to name it either .spec or .test, and then end it with JS like this. So if you were using TypeScript, it would be .spec.ts or .test.ts. Since we're just using JavaScript, I'm going to name it .spec.js or .test.js. Doesn't matter which extension, either test or spec, that you want to use. I personally like to use spec, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that. And now it's going to go ahead and create this file for me. Okay, let's just explore the Jest API very quickly, and then I'll get to actually testing some of our Express route handlers. So we have this describe function, and now you'll notice that right now it isn't going to be imported from anywhere. By default, Jest actually... So the very first function that you're going to be using that comes from the Jest API is this describe function right over here. Now, one thing that I do want to mention is that you could actually import this describe function from @jest/globals like this. and then you can just use it accordingly like this. The thing is though, Jest typically is configured globally, but you can see right now for some reason it is not configured globally. So I'll show you very quickly how we can actually configure Jest to have this describe function and other functions like it, test, before, all, before each, which are hooks. These two are hook functions. I'm going to show you how to configure this so that it's actually global, so we don't have to manually import it in our files. So what you need to do is you need to first create a new file inside your root directory called jsconfig.json, and then you're going to set this object and have this type acquisition property, which is an object, and then you're going to add this include property, which is an array, and then you're going to want to add Jest. Okay, now we don't actually have any types installed, I believe. Let me just double check. Yep, we don't have types for Jest installed, is what I meant to say. So we need to actually install those types in order for us to get it to work. So what I'll do, and you can kind of see that now, it actually recognizes jest.describe globally. But just to be safe, make sure you install the @types/jest package like that. Okay, even though we're not using TypeScript, you can still use this package to have types set up globally like this. Okay, so now you can see that right over here, we have the Jest types over here, and it should recognize them globally without any issues. So going back to our users.spec.js file, I'm going to call this Jest describe function like this. And again, no need to import it. And this describe function is used to create test suites. And basically all that means is it allows you to group together your tests into collections so you can better organize and understand what's going on. So typically you want to give your test suite a generic name that represents what you're trying to actually test for. So for example, if I wanted to, if I wanted to test for a basic, I'm trying to look for something that we can actually test. Let's do this endpoint. So let's say, for example, if I wanted to test this endpoint where I wanted to get a user by ID, then I would just first name the test suite something like get users, and then pass in this callback function. So inside this callback function is where you will actually create your test closures. And those are basically just going to be what's actually going to run your test, and you're going to implement the test logic in there. So to create a test closure, you can use either the it function or the test function. They both work the exact same way. So I'm just going to use it, and then you want to give the test name. So I'll just say something like should get user by ID, and then you want to pass in a callback function. And inside the callback function of your test closure, so the second argument for this it function, this is where you're actually going to invoke the function that you want to test, and then you want to actually write assertions and verify that certain things occurred. Okay? So here's the next part though. We need to actually write a test for some of our functions. So for example, let's say I wanted to test this router.get/API/users/ID endpoint. So this is getting a user by ID. And this is actually one common confusion that many developers begin to have when it comes to writing tests. They look at this and they're like, well, how do I actually test this whole endpoint? Because there's so many things that are going on. Do I need to actually make an HTTP post request or GET request to the actual endpoint that I'm trying to test? So first of all, when it comes to unit testing, you want to actually test only a single piece of your code. Look for individual functions that might be calling other functions. Maybe they are calling a database, maybe they are calling an external API, whatever it is. You want to test that single function, and you want to make sure that the function does what it's supposed to do. So ideally, you want to verify that the function is hitting the right if-else statements, the conditions correctly, and then based on those conditions that are being executed, you want to make sure that it is returning the correct response. So to give you a very simple example, let's take a look at this function right here, okay? So you can see that this function is our request handler, and it first takes this find user index property from request. And this comes from our resolve index by user ID middleware. So don't worry so much about that right now. But we grab this property from the request object. And then we try to reference mock user array and index this user so we can grab the user with its index. So if the user is not found in this mock users array, it's going to go ahead and return a response and send a status of 404. If the user is in fact found, then it's going to go ahead and call response.send find user. So what you need to understand is this function is pretty simple. It doesn't really do too much stuff, but the point is that we want to make sure that we understand what are the possible outcomes of our function. In this situation, there are two possible outcomes only two. Either the user is not found and we return a status of 404, or the user is found and then we just send back the user that was found. There's only two outcomes. Sometimes your functions might have many different outcomes. It might output many different types of results based on the condition. And there are some general principles when it comes to writing your code in a way that makes it easily testable, because writing tests also depends on the code quality as well. If you have a bunch of spaghetti code, you're making it really difficult to actually write tests. Okay, the purpose is not to actually write the most complex code, but to separate concerns and make sure that you have each function doing the main responsibility, and anything else, you turn it into a dependency function is what we like to call it. And that basically just means that you're invoking another function and letting that function take care of the work. And then once that function is done, it'll return back the result and then you can proceed. So we'll start off with a very easy example. We'll use this callback function right over here. But now here's the other problem though, okay? When we actually want to write tests, we want to be able to import the function or class or whatever it is that we're trying to test into our test file. So how do we import this anonymous function? There's no way. So what we need to do is we need to copy this function and we need to move it into we need to turn it into a named function. So what I'll do is I'm gonna actually create a new folder called handlers, and then I'm gonna create a new file, and I'm gonna call this users.mjs. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm going to paste this function right here, and then right before the parentheses, I'm going to do export const. And since this request handler was trying to get the user by ID, I'm going to go ahead and call the function get user by ID handler. And let's make sure that we are importing the correct value. So we need mock users. So I'm going to import that up here. And I think that's all we need. So let's go ahead and copy this function, and we want to make sure that we pass it as an argument to our router.get method call. So at the end like this, and then we're going to make sure we import that up top over there as well. And then now we have our function being passed as an argument. It's still going to work the same exact way. The only difference now is that we can actually import it wherever we want. So I'm going to go into my users.spec.js, and what I'm going to do is first I'm going to import that function. So get user by ID handler. And so this is going to be our system under test or function under test. And now we want to actually call this function. Okay, but we need to also remember that this function does take in two arguments. It takes in a request and a response. So this is where you start to learn how to actually create fake data or mocks, so that way you can use them for your test subjects. In this case, our get user by ID handler function. So when it comes to creating mocks, there are ways to be smart with it. So what we'll do is we'll create two simple objects. Let's call this mock request and then mock response. And remember this, the request and response object resembles the actual request type in Express.js. Okay, so if you were to actually look at, let me go over to here because we're using JavaScript. Okay, so if I were to actually right-click the type definition of this request, you can see that we have this interface, and you can see that there are a lot of properties on the request object itself. Okay, you can see that we have host, cookies, method, params. These were similar methods or properties that we looked at earlier. Signed cookies as well. Now you're probably wondering, well, when I create my mock object, like my mock request, do I need to also include all of those fields? And the answer to that question is actually no. So what you can do is you can only define the fields that you need. Okay, and again, this works because we're using JavaScript. If you're using TypeScript, then you can use casting. For example, you can type annotate the request and force it to be an actual request type, even though it is missing all of its fields. But since we're using JavaScript, we can do literally whatever we want. So for our mock request, we want to include the necessary properties that our code is actually referencing on the request object. So this is where you need to actually look at your code, look at the function that's being tested, and you need to see, okay, what is actually being referenced on the request object? So I can see right over here, one property is being destructured from the request object. So we need to make sure that this, whatever this find user index is, we know that it's a number, but whatever it is, we need to make sure we define that in the mock request object. And it seems like that's the only property that we are referencing. So I know that this is a number because in case if you didn't watch the early parts of the tutorial, this resolve index by user ID middleware function, what it does is it will go ahead and grab the ID from the route parameter and it'll take care of parsing it to an actual integer, and then it'll attach it to the request object. So what I'll do is inside my mock request, I'm going to go ahead and define find, or what was it called again? Find user index. Yep. Find user index. And then you can give it literally any number you want. You can give it 1, 2, 3, 100, literally anything you want. But here's the thing though, we want to give it an actual meaningful value that is going to correlate with our code. So if you look at the rest of your code, you can see that find user index is being used to retrieve an element from this mock users array. And this is our mock users array right over here. And if I were, so for example, if I were to just give like just some bizarre number like 100, it's pretty obvious that that number would not actually give us back anything inside mock users because there is no element at subscript 100 that would give us back a user. Okay, so let's just do something simple for now. Let's just do 1. So that way I know that it'll give me back the user Jack. Okay. All right, so we're done with the mock request object. Now let's go into the mock response. So this is going to be our response object. And now we have to do the same thing. We have to look at our code and look at what response is, and we have to also see what is being referenced on response. So right over here, I can see that response is being referenced right over here, and the send status, this is a method on the response object, is being called. Okay, so I know that send status is a method, so that means that inside the mock response object, we should set this send status property and have it mapped to a function. So you might think that it would look something like this, right? Well, no. So it is going to be a function, but it's not going to be a regular function. It's going to be a mock function. So what we can do in Jest is we can use this Jest namespace, and I can reference jest.fn like this. And what this will do is it'll create a mock function for me. So this is where we actually want to call a mocked function of send status on the response object and not the actual send status method itself. Okay, so we use just.fn to apply this mock function to send status. And then we'll do the same thing for the send method as well. So let's do send, and then this will be just.fn. Okay. All right. So now what we want to do is we want to actually take both of our objects, mock request and mock response, and pass them as arguments to get user by ID handler. So let's do that. So mock request and mock response. Okay. So now if I run my test right now, the test actually should just pass because we're not actually testing for anything. So in our terminal, we'll run npm run test, and this will execute that just binary. And you can see that our test runs and it passes. And just very quickly, I want to show you what would happen if I were to go over here and just kind of like remove this part entirely. And you'll see that it's going to go ahead and complain about all this stuff. So that's the reason why we needed this transform part. Okay, and again, we can also run our application completely separate from our tests like this, and it still would work just fine. Okay, so hopefully the setup with Babel and everything else wasn't too complex, and we can still proceed to use ES modules and write tests. Okay, you can see it's currently running without any issues. Well, awesome. So let's go ahead and go back to our test, and let's actually write our first assertion. So again, let's look at our code again, okay? And what we can see is there's two outputs. There are two things that could happen. Either we send a status of 404 or we send the user back. So this is where we need to understand, okay, well, what should happen inside this test is whatever it is that we want it to happen. Okay, so we have to figure out what it is that we're trying to test for. So in my situation, let's say I want to test to ensure that a user was actually sent back. Okay, and so we already set up our mock request to have find user index to be a value of 1. So when the function is called, it's going to use 1 as the index and search for that mock users. So let's actually write our first assertion. So again, we need to understand what it is that we're trying to test. In my situation right now, I want to test to make sure that the user was actually found and sent back with the response. If I look at the code, okay, how can I verify that the user was sent back? Well, what I can do is I can write an assertion that verifies that this response.send method was called and it passed this find user object as an argument. And I can also write another assertion to verify that send status was not called, because send status would only be called if find user is undefined. And since we are setting find user index to be 1, it's going to use that as the index to reference the user at that position. And mock users is just this constant array that we have over here. So we can just reuse this data because it's not like it's coming from a database or some external API. So we can use this as mock data. So let's go back into our test. And here's what we'll do. We're going to use this expect function like this. And we use the expect function to actually test a value. So for example, I want to test that mock response dot send like this. I want to test this specific function. And then at the end of expect, at the end of the parentheses, we can use these jest matchers. And the one that I want to use is to have been called. So what this means is we are expecting mock response.send. We're expecting this function to have been called. Okay, so that asserts that the function was called when we called this getUserById handler. So let's actually test this out and see what happens. So let's run npm run test. Okay, and you see that it passes. Okay, so again, it takes some time to really, get used to some of these matchers and knowing how to use expect. But as long as you just keep practicing, it's going to come in handy, and you're going to develop an intuition behind it. So you can see that we definitely wrote an assertion on this send function, and we asserted that this function was called. And you'll notice that right now, if I were to try to negate this matcher, so if I actually use .not to have been called, that basically just asserts the opposite. So it's going to assert that mock response.send was not called. So if I run the test, it should fail because the function itself was actually called. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. And it's sometimes good to do that because it helps you assure that you're not having your test pass falsely, if that makes sense. So you don't have any false positives, because sometimes your tests may pass when they actually shouldn't. So let's actually be more specific with our test. So what I'll do is I'll duplicate this line, and I'm going to use the matcher to have been called with. And this is what I want to use whenever I want to verify that a function was called with specific parameters. So the send function is called with only one argument, and this argument is a user itself. Now, again, since we are using a mock array, I can very easily just reference the array at the subscript of whatever find user index is, which is 1. So I can just go ahead and import this mock users right over here. So let's import that, and that gets imported up top here. And then I'm just going to access it like this. Okay. Or if you wanted to, you could just literally copy this whole thing and paste it in like this. Either one will work the same way because they're both going to be the same object and the contents are the same. Let's go ahead and run our test now. And you can see that it still passes. And you'll notice that if I tried to, let's say if I tried to pass in this direct object, and let's just say if I tried to change some property values right over here, let's change the username. You're going to see that the test actually fails because the value that was actually passed as an argument to the send function is not the same as what we were asserting it to be. So you can see that the expected value, we expected username of Jack without the K, so JAC, but then the actual received value was username of Jack. So again, this is good to make sure that your tests are actually passing correctly. Okay, so let's run the test again, and it should just pass, just like that. All right, so hopefully this makes sense. And there's also one more assertion that I want to show you. So we can also check to see the amount of times this send function was called. So I can do to have been called times, and I can specify the expected amount. So if I want to verify that this send function was called once, then I can just pass 1. And it should only be called once, especially in Express, because if you try to call it twice, that will actually throw an error. Let's run the test again. And of course, if I try to pass in like 2, it'll throw an error or the test will fail. You can see over here, the actual received number of calls was 1. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And one more thing as well that I forgot to mention is that with this to have been called with matcher, you can actually pass in the number of arguments that the function is called with. So we only have 1 over here, but if you had a function that was called with like multiple arguments, you can pass in the exact amount. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. Let's write another test to handle the second scenario of our function. So the other scenario would be where find user is not found, and it sends back a status code of 404. So I'm going to write another test using the it function, and I'm going to go ahead and say it should call send status with 404 when user not found. Okay, you want to keep your test names short and simple. And we're going to go ahead and write our test. So now here's the thing though, okay? If I were to call get user by ID handler again, and then if I were to pass in the same mock objects, it's going to actually give us this same response that we have up over here. But the problem is now we want to actually get it so that we can set up our code to ensure that the send status function is called instead of the send function. Okay, if I were to just leave mock request alone, you can see that it's still using the same value for find user index, and in the code it'll actually look for a user and return that user. So it would never hit this part at all, line 6. So we need to actually modify the mock request object. So what we need to do is, there are a couple ways that you can do this. If you prefer to not modify the object directly like this and set it to a value like this, you can always just create like a copy of it. So you can do something like const, and then you can do mock request, or let's just do copy mock request equals, and then you can do something like find user index is equal to 100, and then of course you can also destructure mock request, because there might be some properties that you want to copy over to the copy of the mock request. So you can do something like this and then pass in copy mock request to here. For mock response, we don't really have anything that we need to change because we still have the same functions. So it doesn't really matter. So we can leave that alone. Okay. So we're going to call get user by ID handler with a new request object, but we're going to set the find user index property to a value that I know that will not give us back a user. In this case, we'll set it to 100. Okay, so when we call this function, we now want to write some assertions. So what I can do is I can write an assertion to verify that this send status function was called. So let's do expect mock response send status to have been called. And then let's run the test. And you can see our second test passes without any issues. Let's write a few more assertions. So let's do expect mock response send status to have been called with 404. Let's run the test again. Passes. And I can just throw in a value that I know is actually not going to pass. You can see that it fails, so that's good. Because it shouldn't be sending a 400, it should be sending a 404. And I can also do to have been called times. Let's do 1. Let's run the test again. And let's also write an assertion where we verify that mock response.send was not called. So expect mock response send not to have been called. Let's run the test. Wonderful. So all of our assertions are good. Now, one more thing that I do want to do though is if you go inside your Jest config file and if you look for clear mocks, you want to make sure this is set to true. Earlier when we were configuring Jest, we had press yes when it asked us if we wanted to configure our test to clear all mock calls, instances, and contexts and results before every test. Because what happens is if this is false, the next test will actually carry over data from the previous test. So if I actually try to run my test now, you're going to see now our second test actually fails. And it's actually failing because right over here on line 32, where I have this assertion, expect mock response.send not to have been called, you can see that it's failing because it says receive number of calls 1. So it in fact was called. But if you think about it, your code itself says otherwise, because I know for a fact that in my code, response.send should not be called because we are returning response.send status. So this code doesn't get executed when find user is not defined. Okay? The reason why it's failing this test right over here and it's treating it as if send was actually called is because in the previous test, the send function was called and it was called one time. Okay, so since it was called one time and we didn't clear the mocks, it carried over to the next test right over here inside this second test over here. So there's several ways they can do this. The first thing that you can do is obviously what we already had was having clear mocks set to true instead of false. The other thing that you can do is you can use this before each hook, and this takes in the callback function, and basically you can execute some logic that happens before each one of your tests. So you can initialize a variable, you can connect to a database, whatever it is that you want. So you can actually use this jest.clearAllMocks function call. And now if I run my test, it passes. Okay, so this is manually clearing all the mocks before each test. Sometimes you might not want to clear all the mocks because you might want to depend on previous function calls from the previous test. So you might want to turn off clear mocks and set it to false. Sometimes you just want to manually clear the mocks, so you can use this before each. It's up to you, but I just wanted to mention that as well. So I'm just going to remove this before each, and I'm going to set clear mocks back to true. So hopefully these two tests that we wrote makes sense. Now I have one more example where we can write a unit test for another one of our endpoints, but this one's going to be a little bit longer, so I just wanted to warn you all, but I'll try my best to keep it as concise as possible. And I want to do this one because there's a lot of stuff going on inside this function, and I think it would be really great for you all to learn how to test different scenarios, okay? So what I'm going to do is for my post endpoint for API/users, this request handler creates the user and saves it to a database. So you're going to learn how to mock functions that come from modules. You're going to learn how to mock classes, ES6 classes. You're going to learn how to mock the database call, so that way we don't actually hit the actual database, because when it comes to unit tests, you don't want to actually invoke your database or call an external API. So you're going to learn how to do a lot of stuff with this next test. So we need to make sure we get this function out of this format. We don't want it to be an anonymous function. So I'm going to just copy that, and I'm going to go inside, let's see, not here, but inside my handlers file, or the users.mjs file inside handlers. And I'm going to go ahead and paste this here. And I'll name this function create user handler like this. And before I import all of the necessary functions into this file, let me just take this and let me just paste it here and import it up top over here. Okay. And now let's go ahead and go back to our users.mjs file inside the handlers folder, and we need to make sure we import all of the necessary functions that we imported that were in the other files. So validation result comes from Express Validator. That's a validation library that can validate post requests, request bodies, query parameters, all that kind of stuff. We need to also import match data. That's also a function from Express Validator. Hash password is a function that we wrote ourselves. Let's import that over here. User is the Mongoose model. So this is what actually allows us to interact with our database, but we're not actually going to call the database. We're going to mock out this as well. And I think that should be it. Okay, so now let's go ahead and go into our users.spec.js file. And then now I'm going to create a new test suite. So outside of this describe get users, I'm going to go ahead and create another describe, and I'm going to call this create users. So you can think of these individual it functions, these individual tests, as your scenarios. Okay. So inside the create users test suite, I'm going to go ahead and create a simple test, and I'll just say it should, let's see, let's go back into our function. Okay, so this is a pretty big function. It does a lot. So I want to take this step by step so that way you all don't get confused. First, let me just remove these console logs because we're not going to need them. Whoops. So we want to take this step by step because there are a lot of things that are going on. So let's take a look at our code and understand what's going on. So when we call this create user handler, when Express calls this function to handle the create user endpoint, it's going to go ahead and call validation result. So when you're looking at the code, the important part is not to really worry about what these functions, these external functions, because we don't know what these functions, let's just pretend we don't know what it does. You don't have to care about what this function does. You have to care about what it returns, because we're going to mock the function anyways. We're going to mock the implementation. We're going to mock the return value of the function. So in the end, it doesn't really matter. Okay, what I care about is what it returns. So result, you might not know what it is. You might think it's an object, it's a number, it's a string. You might not know, but you can very easily tell if you just look at the rest of the code and look at where result is being referenced. So you can see right over here that result has this isEmpty method that's being called on it, and I immediately know that this is an object. Okay, there's also this array method on result as well. So what I can do is I can go ahead and actually mock out validation result, because this is known as a dependency. It's a function that can perform some kind of side effect, and we don't want to actually have any side effects in our unit tests. We want to make sure that we mock them all out, and we only want to test the function itself. We only care about the possible paths our function that we're trying to test can take. So again, you can see right over here, this is our first if condition. If result dot is empty, if it is, let's say if this results to false, and then we negate that value. So if it is not empty, then we're going to return this response status of 400 and then send back whatever this value is. Again, I know it's an array because we wrote this out ourselves, but we're just pretending that we don't know. Okay, so this is the first thing that it could do. The second thing that could happen is right down over here. So you can see that we have this new user.save being called, and then it sends back a status of 201 and it sends the user. Okay, so this is the second scenario. The third scenario is that an error could be thrown inside this try block. So the save method could have thrown an error, and then we catch it down over here, and then we send back a status of 400. Okay, now there actually should be another scenario where the hashing password failed, and we actually should have added this inside the try catch, but we're just going to leave it the way it is right now. Okay, so hopefully all of this makes sense. So now if I were to go back up top over here, again, the validation result is one dependency. Okay, so what we want to do right now is we want to test our function to handle this first scenario first, because instead of just having to do everything all at once, we're going to take it step by step. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a test that is going to mock out this validation result function call. We're going to have it return literally whatever object we want, but that object specifically needs to have this isEmpty method, as well as this result, as well as this array method on the result object, because they are both going to be called. Okay, so we need to make sure that whatever isEmpty is going to return, it returns false for this case, because I can see that we negate the value of result.isEmpty. So for example, if there are no errors, that's what this isEmpty method means. If there are no errors, you can see right over here, it returns true if there are no errors. So if this is true, the negation of this would not execute this line, and it would just go down over here, which means that there are no errors. However, if isEmpty is false, then result.isEmpty would return false, which means that we negate that, which means it would return this part over here. So for our first scenario, we want isEmpty to return false, just so that we can target this line over here. So what I'm going to do inside my users.spec.js file is this. So I actually already have some mock data defined up there. Just to keep things simple, I'm actually just going to define it inside test suite. So const mock request, and then const mock response. And then it'll be within the closure of this callback function, so we don't have to really worry about the ones defined up there. So what I'll do is for the test scenario, I will say it should return a status of 400 when there are errors. And we'll pass on our callback function. Okay, so now we need to go ahead and set up our mocks, our mock request and mock response to actually get this to work. So again, we have to look at our request object, and we want to see within these two lines, where is our request object being referenced? You can see that it's being passed as an argument to validation result. However, it's not going to really matter because we're going to mock validation result. So we actually aren't really going to need to do anything with the mock request for this specific scenario. Okay, so let's look at response. I can see that response is referencing this status method right over here. So right over here, we're going to go ahead and do status just.fn. And you know what? I actually could just reuse mock response up top over here, because we're going to be using some of these similar methods anyways. So you know what I'll do is I'm just going to remove this, and I'll just reuse the mock response up here. And it shouldn't matter because we are clearing all of the mocks anyways before every test, so we won't have any leftover data from the previous test. Okay, so let's go ahead and implement the status method. And this is also going to be a mock function, so we'll use just.fn. Okay, now one more thing that I do want to point out is that after we call the status method, we actually are calling the send method as well, because when you call this status method, it actually returns the instance of the response itself, and you can actually call the status method on it as many times as you want, because it just returns the response instance itself. So in order for us to actually detect calls on the send function, inside status over here, inside just.fn for status, we actually want to pass a callback function, and we want to actually return mock response, so basically returning itself. So that way, by returning itself, mock response would then have access to all these other methods as well. And if we don't do this, we wouldn't be able to actually test to see if .send was called after .status. And I'll show you that when we actually write the test. Okay, so we're not done yet. We're done with setting up our mock request and our mock response. We need to now mock this validation result function. And you're probably wondering, well, how do I do that? This is a function that comes from a third-party module, Express Validator. Well, I'll show you. So you can mock modules, and what that basically means is you can override the implementation and the functionality that module's API provides. So for example, inside the Express Validator module, we have a bunch of functions, we have a bunch of different things that we can import that we can use in our application however we want. Now, for our case, we only are using validation result currently, so we want to mock validation result specifically. So all the way up top over here, what I can do is I can reference jest.mock, and then I want to specify the name of the module. So I'm going to go ahead and say Express Validator like this. So this will mock that NPM module. You can also mock your own modules that you create as well. So for example, later on when we need to mock the hash password function, we're also going to mock this helpers module as well. Okay, and that's our local module. So as a second argument, after we pass Express Validator for the first one, the second argument is going to be a factory. So this is where you're going to return an object, because if you think about it, your modules are kind of like objects, and those objects have the named exports. Okay, assuming it does. So what we want to do is we want to return this object like this. So notice how I have the parentheses wrapped around the curly brace. So that just allows me to do it shorthand instead of having to do something like this. Okay, so what I'll do is inside the object, I want to mock the validation result function. So I'm going to type validation result like that, and I'm going to do just.fn like that. So now I have successfully mocked the validation result function for the Express Validator module. And now this mock function, we want it to actually return something, so that way we can actually have this result value be something that is defined with the correct isEmpty and array methods. So we can do that inside our just.fn function. We can pass in a callback that also returns an object as well. And I can go ahead and define the isEmpty method. So isEmpty is going to be a mock function as well. But this mock function, remember, we're going to have it return false. Okay, so pass in that callback, return false like this. And then we also want to implement this array method on the return value of validation result. So this is a method, and it does return an array. So we will have it return an array like this. And then what you can do is you can add some random object with random fields. So you can just say message invalid username. Just like an example, you can literally put whatever you want, like invalid field, whatever it is. Okay, because we can always actually modify, we can always override the return value of validation result, and I'll show you how to do that as well. Okay, so I think we're good to go. Let's actually go ahead and test everything out. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and call create user handler. So let's go ahead and import that up top over here. Oh, whoops, I can just import that from right over here. Wonderful, because it's coming from the same file. Okay, so let's go ahead and call create user handler. Let's pass in the mock request, and notice how we're referencing this local mock request because this is the closure. We're inside this closure over here. And then we're going to reference the mock response, which is all the way up there. So we are reusing that same mock response object from earlier. Okay, and remember that this function is asynchronous, so we should also await the call. And we need to make sure we add the async keyword in front of this callback function for the it function, okay? All right, so let's just make sure everything is okay. So if I run npm run test, the test does pass, but we aren't writing any assertions, so that's okay. And you'll notice how now if I actually try to kind of like remove all this, all the mocks that we just did, you'll start to notice that a lot of stuff starts to error out, and you can see that it's actually trying to go to line, seems like line 8 over here inside the helpers.mjs. So it's actually, without mocking anything, it actually tries to call the actual Express validator library. So it's actually calling the functions, okay? And then it's gonna try to execute everything the way it is. But you can see over here, it tries to throw this error right over here because we don't have a value for password. But we'll get to that because right now our request body has nothing, okay? And we also aren't mocking match data yet. So don't worry, step by step, just wanted to show you what would happen if we remove the mock stuff, okay? So let's add that back in. And you can see that everything will work the same way. All right, so now let's actually write an assertion. So the first thing that I want to do is this. So when it comes to testing, there are different ways that you can approach testing. There's implementation testing, and that's where you're actually testing the actual implementation. So you're trying to verify that certain functions are called with certain parameters. That's known as implementation testing. There's also behavioral testing, where you just give it some input. You don't care what it does as long as it gives you an output. So there's different ways on how you can test this. With backend, you can't really go wrong with either one. Usually on the front end, like if you're testing apps in React, you would want to use behavioral driven testing because you want to test based on output and you don't care about what actually happens underneath the hood with all of the state and all of the form fields and whatever is being called to the API, stuff like that. So I just wanted to point that out. Okay, but since we're just getting started, I'm just going to show you very basic how to write assertions. So what I want to do is I want to verify that validation result was called with the request object. Okay, so the question is, how do I actually write the assertion for validation result? Because in my whole test file, I don't have any access to validation result. Well, I'll show you. So the first thing that we can do, and I'll import this over here on line 1, is I'm going to import the entire Express validator library, but I'm going to import it as like a default import like this. So import validator from Express validator like this. And then now down over here in our test, after I call the create user handler function, I can write an assertion, and I can reference validator.validation result to have been called times 1. And let's run our test. And you can see that it passes. And if I were to set this to 0 to see if it actually fails, and it should fail, you can see that it was actually called once, so that verifies that it was actually called. And if I were to actually remove, just kind of like remove this whole thing right over here, you can see that our test begins to fail and it's not recognizing validation result as a function. If I remove this whole just.mock, and if I try to run the test again, you're going to see that other stuff starts to fail as well. Okay, so hopefully this helps you understand the importance of mocking out your modules, and hopefully this helps you understand how to mock out these functions that come from the Express Validator package, or just any package in general. Okay, let's go ahead and continue. So I'll do validator.validation result. So I'm going to write an assertion to say that to have been called with mock request, because if you look right over here, we are passing whatever request object this is to validation result. So we'll write the assertion there. It passes. And let me just change this to have been called instead of to have been called times 1. Okay, that's a lot more better because this basically implies that's going to be called once, or to have been called at least once. Okay, so now we want to also write an assertion that response.status was called with a status code of 400. So let's do that. So expect response dot, I think it was status, and it's mock response to have been called with a 400 mock response. Okay, let's run our test. Okay, it passes, good. And let's go ahead and write an assertion to verify that the .send method was called. So we can do expect mock response, and this will be mock response.send, not mock response.status.send. Because remember that when we call the send method, we're still calling it on the instance of the response method. So we would have to reference mock response. So to have been called with, and then we want to verify that it was called with this array. And that's whatever we had mocked over here. So I'm just going to take that, copy, and paste it down over here. Let's run the test again. And it passes. And again, I can go ahead and just change everything up and make sure that our test is passing correctly. And you can see it throws an error when I pass in the invalid expected argument. Okay, so that's pretty good. Let's go ahead and move on now, because we've covered this whole part over here. So now we have to cover the next few lines over here, everything up until down over here. So we are calling this matched data function, but we aren't mocking it. Okay, so it's going to actually call the actual match data function, which comes from express validator. So we want to mock it, because what I want to do is I want to mock this function to return some object, which is going to be the actual user data. So again, to give you context, what this function does is it takes the request body and it gives you the validation result. Okay, so if there are no errors, then what happens over here with match data is match data will extract all of the valid fields in the request body and store it inside this data object. So all we really need to do is just mock match data to return a valid user object. So let's do this. Okay, so going back up over here, I'm going to do matched data just.fn, and we're going to have it return an object. And keep in mind that whatever the return value of matched data is actually just going to be an object, so there's no methods on it that we would need to worry about, because we're not referencing anything except for just the password field. So let's just do, let's see, username. Let's do test password, password. And then I think the other field was, I think it was display name, if I remember correctly. Let me check. If I go inside my validation schema, so we have username, display name, and password. Yep. So display name. Just do test name. Now, some of you might be asking, well, what's the point of doing all of this mocking? Because doesn't that kind of defeat the whole purpose of testing? Well, no, not for unit testing, because remember, our goal is not to actually test to make sure that, express validator works. Our goal is to test create user handler works, our own function. This is a unit test. Okay, when you want to actually test the entire application, that is where you want to actually set up an integration test or an end-to-end test, which you will learn about it later. Okay, so hopefully that kind of clarifies the confusion between mocking and actually testing the entire thing without mocking it. Okay, all right, so now that we've mocked match data, this function to return a mocked result, so we can safely run the rest of our code. And then we want to make sure that this match data function is going to be called, but we also want to make sure that we don't hit this if condition and make this true. So we need to actually make isEmpty return true this time, which means that there are no errors. But the thing is, though, I mocked it up top over here to return false. So what if I changed it to true, but then that would break my first test over here? So we can't do that. So I'll show you what we can do to actually change the return value for our specific tests. Okay, because we want this isEmpty function to return true for whenever we call validation result. So that way, this if condition results to false, and then it'll go down over here and call match data. Okay, so let me just make sure that we have our match data function mocked properly. Okay, this is good. Let's go down over here and let's write our next test. And I'm going to go ahead and call this test, let's see. So I guess the overall thing that we are trying to test for is making sure that the response.status is sending back a 201 and it's sending back the user that was created. So essentially we're testing for success for creating the user. So I'll just say it should return status of to 1 and the user created. Okay, and let me actually go up here and let me fix this. Should return status of 400. Okay, so let's add the async keyword in front of our callback function for this test. And now we're going to go ahead and call create user handler. So after we call our function, we want to actually mock out the isEmpty method to return true. So that way it goes to the match data function call. So inside our test, here's what we're going to do. We're going to use jest.spyOn. And I'm going to go and reference this import up here, validator. So that's the entire Express validator package. And then we're going to spy on this function right over here. It's validation result. Like this. Okay. And then what I can do is I can use this mock implementation once. And then in here, this is where I can actually mock the actual implementation of the function. And I can have it return an object, so the same result object, but this time that object will have this isEmpty function. So this is also going to be a mock function, and it will return true like that. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So this is how I can override the mocked value of validation result into something else. So now what will happen is create user handler will be called. It's going to go ahead and call validation result, and then result.isEmpty will be called. And we can see that's going to result to true, and then negating that will cause this whole if condition to be false, and then it will go down over here. So what I can do is I can write an assertion to verify that matched data is called. So let's do expect. So remember, match data is a function that comes from the Express validator package. So I'm going to reference validator.matchedData to have been called. And let's save and let's run our test. And let's make sure that it passes. Okay, so it actually is, let's see. Okay, yeah, don't worry about this. So it is actually supposed to pass, but the reason why it's failing is because right now it's actually trying to call the next few functions. It's trying to call hash password, and then it's also trying to call the database by saving this new user to the database. So don't worry, it is working. It's just that it's trying to connect to the database, and you can see that it actually timed out because we don't actually have a database connection. So don't worry, we actually did the right thing. We just need to mock the rest of our function. Okay, so we know that match data is being called. And you know what? Let me just comment all this out and run the test again because I just want to show you all that it passes. Great. So now let's go ahead and mock hash password because, again, we don't want to actually call these functions because, remember, these functions, these dependencies produce side effects. Okay? So we're going to go up top over here. And now I want to mock this hash password function that comes from my helpers module. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call just.mock, and I want to pass the path to that module. So we're in the test folder, so we need to go out one folder into utils helpers.mjs like this. Okay? And what I want to do is I want to have hash password. I want to mock the implementation. So let me pass in the factory and return an object and just override hash password. And so this will be a mock function, but I actually want to have it return some custom logic. And all I want to make it do is take in an argument. So I'll just do password. So inside this callback function, I can pass in this argument password. And all I'm going to do is just concatenate hashed with password like this. I'm just going to literally prefix the password with hash. So that way it at least does something. Okay. All right. So we just mocked hash password or hash password. So now let's go ahead and import up top over here. we're going to import helpers from utils helpers. Okay, and this would allow me to reference helpers like an object, and I should be able to reference hash password, or maybe I need to do import as helpers. Yeah, there we go. Okay. I think I may have needed to do that as well for validator. I'm not too sure. But let me just run everything and make sure it's good. Let me go over here and just comment this out real quick. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Okay, just wanted to make sure that didn't break. Okay, so now we're going to go down over here, and we have wrote an assertion for the matched data function, okay, to have been called. Let me also change this to have been called with mock request to be more specific. And then we're going to go ahead and write an assertion for hash password. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to expect helpers.hash password to have been called. And I want to verify that it was called with data.password. So data.password is going to be whatever matched data returned. So up top over here, matched data returned password. So I'm going to say to have been called with password, like that. You know what? For the rest of this test, let me just comment out all this stuff over here because I do want to actually see our assertions passing. Okay, good. So to have been called with password. And then I also want to make sure that hash password, so helpers.hash password, returns with the correct value. So to have returned with hashed password. And I know I'm just hard coding these values, but ideally for you, you would probably not want to hard code these values, so that way you can make it more dynamic. But I'm just doing this for testing purposes, okay? Just to show you an example. So if I run the test, you can see that it will, in fact, return hashed password, and that's just our mock implementation right over here, nothing special. But at least it is returning with something, so we can verify that data.password is storing the correct return value. Okay, so now the next part, we want to test this part over here. You see how we are creating a new user? So this is where we are invoking the constructor of a class. So now you're probably wondering, well, how do we test that? So what we can do is we can actually mock these ES6 classes. It's actually not that difficult, and I'll show you how to do it. So what we can do is right over in our test file, up top over here, I can go here, jest.mock, and I can just pass the path to our user right over here, this user.mjs file inside mongoose schemas. So I need to go out one directory to mongoose schemas user.mjs. Okay. And then up top over here, you know what, let me remove this mock users import. Let me import user from the mongoose schemas user.mjs file. Okay, so I just mocked that whole module right over here. And now what we can do is, so I uncommented this line over here where we call the new user constructor. And I can write an assertion and I can say expect user. So I'm referencing the entire model, which is a class, and that's coming from this import right over here. Okay, this is our model right over here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the to have been called assertion. And I'm going to run the test, and it's going to pass. So this verifies that the constructor was actually invoked. If I comment this out, you're going to see that it's going to fail because it actually was called, or it actually wasn't called, but we wrote the assertion to see that it was called. So let me uncomment that, and let's just change this to have been called with the correct arguments. So we want to make sure that it was called with the correct username, display name, and the hashed password. Okay, so in our test, let's go back up over here. So notice how this is the return value of matched data, because we are passing matched data, whatever this return value is, into the user constructor, only with the password being hashed. So what I can do is I can pass in that object and just change this to hashed password. And remember, this value comes from our mock function over here. We just prefixed hashed underscore with whatever the password is. So let's go ahead and run the test. And you can see that now it passes. So that's good. And now one more thing that I also want to show you is if you wanted to access the instance that was created, so the user instance, you can do that by referencing user, and it's going to attach this mock property onto that user. And then you can reference instances at subscript 0, because we only created one instance. And then let's run the test again. And you can see right over here, we have the instance, and this instance has this save method as well. And you could, of course, also reference the properties on it. So let's go ahead and continue testing the rest of our code. So I'm going to uncomment this out. And since we've already mocked out the user model, or mongoose model, I can actually just run my test, and we shouldn't get the same errors that we had before, because all that is mocked out already. Okay, this save method is mocked, everything. So what I want to do is I want to verify that the save method was called on the instance, this new user instance. So what I can do is this. I can actually create another spy on this save method so I can keep track of its calls, because there's no way for me to directly access this unless if I get the instance. So for example, if I wanted to, I could do user.mock.instances 0.save to have been called, like that. And this should work without any problem. Yep, and then if I try to negate this call to verify that it's not passing incorrectly, you can see that it actually was called. So this is one way that you can do this. The other way that you can do this is you can use a spy, and I'll show you how to do that. So I'll create a variable, I'll call this save method equals just.spyOn, and I can reference user.prototype, like that. And then what I can do is I can specify the actual method itself on the instance. So save is one of the methods, and then leave it like that. And what I can do is I can go ahead and replace this part to be expect save method to have been called. Okay, and if I run test again, the test will pass. And if I try to add the not operator in front of it, you can see that by adding a not operator, the test fails because it actually was called. So what I want to do specifically is I want to actually mock the return value of save. So what I'm going to do is at the end of just.spyOn, I'm going to call mock resolved value once. And I want save to just return the user that should be saved to the database. But I'm just going to attach an ID. You don't have to do this, but I'm just going to do it anyways. And then I'm going to copy that. So that way, like the reason why I'm attaching the ID is that way it makes it feel like it's being saved to the database, even though it's not, because MongoDB generates an ID for us. So now what I'll do is I'm going to go down over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, let's see. So we are asserting that save was called. So now let's write an assertion on response.status. We'll verify that it was called with the status code of 201, and then we'll verify that the response object was called with the send method, or it called the send method with the saved user, which means that it includes that user over here that we are mocking the resolved value. So let's do expect mock response dot status to have been called with 201. And then let me just go down here. Let me change this to mock response dot send. And let me just copy this object, paste it here. And we should be good. So let's test this out. Let me run my test. And you can see that our test passes. So that's good. All right, so we've covered 2 cases so far for our create user handler. Let's go ahead and cover the last case. This one's going to be pretty easy. We just need to get it to actually throw this error. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and create a new test. So I'll go ahead and call this test. Let's see. It should throw error when save, or let's see, it should send a status code of 400 when save errors out. Okay, so everything else is good except for when the save method is called, maybe something failed the database, and then it throws this error and it sends a status of 400. So let's do, it should send status of 400 when database fails to save user. So I think that's good enough. And let's make this an async method. So we're going to, let's see, we're going to copy this create user handler right here. So everything is going to be roughly the same as the previous test. So I do also want to copy this just.spy on, because we do want to make sure that we are going past this part. We're going all the way down, but then we just want it to fail when it calls the save method, okay? So the thing is, though, we don't need to rewrite all of these assertions because we already did before. So let me do this, const save method. Yep, so let me copy this save method equals just.spy on. Let me copy this part. And now what we are going to do is we're going to go ahead and for the save method for this spy, we're going to mock the implementation one time. And remember, this save method throws, it could throw an error, but we're just going to mock the implementation. So when it does throw an error, then it's going to handle this catch block over here. But since this save method is asynchronous, it returns a promise. So we have to do promise.reject, and we'll just say failed to save user. Okay, so now we're basically overriding the save method to actually error out, return an error. So everything in our code should be good. And then once it gets to this save method, it's going to go ahead and error out. And then we're going to go ahead and write an assertion on response.sendStatus. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. Let's do expect save method to have been called. And then what we'll do is we'll do expect mock response that's send status right over here to have been called with 400. And let's go ahead and run our test. Let's make sure that it works. And there we go. We have covered all 3 cases. If you want, you can go ahead and write some assertions for some of these functions to verify that they were called, but you don't really have to, because it would just kind of be redundant with what we have up here. Because at this point in this test, we know that all of these functions are being called. It's just that we're trying to get to the point right down over here to make sure that we are testing for this send status being called with a status code of 400. And if I were to pass 401, that test would fail because it is supposed to be 400. And there you go. So hopefully all of this makes sense. I know this part of the tutorial was pretty long, but that's because there's a lot of stuff that I wanted to cover. And I felt like with this specific test, you learn so much with how to mock modules, how to mock classes, how to mock your own modules that you create yourself on in your source code, so your local modules, and just a lot of stuff about unit testing. So hopefully this tutorial made sense, and I would highly encourage you to practice writing more tests, more unit tests for your other functions as well. So for example, one thing that I can encourage you to do is maybe for the local strategy, if this is something that you have, you can go ahead and take, let's see, you can probably take this part out. You can take this anonymous function out, put it in a separate file and import it in here. And then that way you can actually import that function into a test file and test the logic in here. And using the logic that I showed you with how to mock and how to override values of functions by mocking them out, you can write those unit tests. So hopefully all of this makes sense.